Hi, Milena.
Hi.
How are you today?
Good. How are you?
I'm good. I'm excited to look at some photos together. Um,
Mm.
I wanted to first, if I wanted to just let you introduce your film, tell us the name and where it was filmed, basically the big pictures, and then I wanted to share some photos from the archive for us to discuss.
All right. So the film is called The Sun and the Looking Glass, for one easily forgets, but the tree remembers. That's the whole length title. It was shot in the summer 2019 in Ain, Kenya. It's a village a few kilometers away from Ramallah in Palestine. And it was made during an artistic residency in a magnificent place called Sakia. Um, yep, that's
No, that sounds great. The thing that I found the most interesting about the film is that you have a protagonist, which is a tree, basically. And so when I was looking for which archival images we wanted to talk about today, um, I was surprised that I found exactly the same tree. So it's called the Qaykab tree in Arabic. And in this archival photo, I'll share it now. It's called a strawberry tree. So I think this is like maybe one of the common English names. Um, this is from a catalog of photos from the American colony. Um, and we can look at the catalog in a minute. But first, I just wanted to think a little bit about and hear from you about the tree being the protagonist of the film. It's an unusual choice, but very interesting and compelling, I think.
yes. So that specific tree which appears in the film is so it's located on the land in which I spent my residency, and it's a tree which is now roughly 200 years old. So when I started to work there and to write, the first process of my film was very much about writing. It appeared very quickly as a very important element in the landscape. And I was also very much interested in seeing how I could somehow lend a voice to the tree, and to have him almost as a narrator, not only a protagonist, but almost as a narrator.
Oh yeah, that's very
And
interesting.
the reason also behind it was since that tree is there for such a long time, it appeared to me as a witness of history and as a silent witness. And it also has a very particular appearance because its bark is always kind of peeling.
Hmm.
So you have all the different layers of the trunk that yeah, go away slowly, and it has very different shades of colors. So the more it's to the thinner and younger part of the bark, it's very green, and then slowly it goes to the red, and then to a dark brown. And it's also reminded me of maybe the different layers of history and of the story I wanted to look at.
Yeah, that's really interesting because we've been talking a little bit about the archive as a place of fragments. And so I wanted to ask you about the kind of different textures that we see in the film and in the landscape. There's text, there's the sunlight, there's the bark that you mentioned, there's some paint on different natural things like rocks that I wanted to ask you about, but also thinking about sort of the fragments in the archive. I thought it was interesting and strange that this photo even existed, and so I'm going to show this next picture, which is where the image comes from. So in the 19 and this is from 1927, but the American colony photographers who took that picture had a sort of catalog which they sold photographs of Palestine as the Bible lands. They sold them in Jerusalem to tourists, and they sold them also in other. They had branches in New York and other places. And so it was interesting to find this tree, the strawberry tree. It's here on page 81, listed as one of the photos that you can buy, one of the the slides that you can buy. and this idea of the landscape in Palestine, that even the trees have a connection to the Bible, or that they somehow, people might want to collect those images so that they have remnants kind of touching that place, is interesting. It's disconnected slightly from obviously your project, but I thought the relationship between sort of like the fact that flora and fauna have been a subject of photographs or film for such a long time in Palestine, I think is interesting. So I'll go to this next photo, which is the other photo from this collection of the clay club tree. But can you speak a little bit about the fragments in the landscape that we see in your film, and any thoughts on how it connects to the archive and sort of this larger history of photographing or filming the landscape in Palestine?
Well, I guess most of my work somehow has always been revolving around the research about how we tell stories and how we select fragments and how we exclude others in order to make it into a story and to transmit it, and how some parts of stories are purposely or not forgotten, and some are put forward into the light. And somehow, in Palestine, it's something that has been very much instrumentalized. And like picturing the landscape, but also the historical research and the archaeological research has also very much been a tool of justifying domination. So it's very, it's at the core of my research in general. And I guess also when I was there and I was working on the project, my first contact with the place was also through objects that were found during renovations of the houses. So the residency is on a hill, and there's two houses from the late Ottoman period, which are now being renovated. And during the process, the people behind Sakia found a lot of artifacts there. So pieces of ceramics, of spoon, of many different objects, rusty can and stuff like that.
Mm-hmm.
And they collected them and they showed them to me. And these fragments of the past that they took from the ground and cared for and selected were very much also triggering this relation between like the kind of fractal aspect of the story, and how somehow a tiny piece of glass or a pot could also be used to tell a story.
Yeah, that's so interesting, because that's very, like you mentioned, archaeology. It is a very almost archaeological, but some of those objects maybe are not even that old. So, what I guess one of my questions for you is also, we talked about a little bit the narrator and the protagonist being a tree, and then there's also this aspect of the film is void of any people. So there's no human beings in the photograph, in the film, sorry. And it reminded me a little bit about this genre of Bible land photography, and how the landscapes used to be emptied of people. So the focus was usually on, in the earlier period, was usually on landscapes, on ruins of villages, on any sort of historical or archaeological sites, but trying to minimize the people in the photograph. So Issam Nassar talks a lot about this. Bashar Dumani also talks about it as a part of the colonial project. And at that point, we're talking about the European colonial project before the British Mandate begins. But it seems like even between the Ottoman kind of control of Palestine, the British Mandate, and then Zionist colonization, which is ongoing, those pieces that you found, so even if it's a late Ottoman house, and then there's sort of like a rusty can, how do those things connect with the natural landscape? So they feel like human remains, but there's no people anywhere in in the ruins or in your film. So can you speak a little bit about the human relationship with these fragments?
So what was, I think, and the reason for them to have these empty landscapes is obviously very different than my reason for it.
Yeah.
Their purpose was to somehow sell the image of an empty land without people, so that people could appropriate it. And my reason is actually quite the opposite. I mean, we don't see any human in the film, but we don't hear humans neither. And so we don't even have voices or languages, spoken language to listen to. And this this very strong decision was actually quite political in my perspective, in the way that I wanted to explore another way of relating to a story, a different way than the more journalistic kind of reportage or interview way.
Mm-hmm.
And my desire behind it was to somehow make it closer to the viewer. So there's a lot of text, poetic writing in the film that appears in the image in a very specific way. And I thought if one reads, then one hears its own voice. And when hearing one's own voice, maybe it gets closer to the viewer, and it prevents somehow this kind of exclusion of the other, of considering the other as different for physical appearance, for accent, for language, for many different reasons. And so it was very important for me not to fall in this way of picturing the other, which has been so much used in media mainly, and also in filmmaking, in documentary filmmaking. And it always kind of install a power relation between the person behind the camera and the person in front of the camera.
Mm-hmm.
And that's something I was very careful with. And I really didn't want to kind of fall on the usual tracks of considering this story as from others, basically.
Yeah, that's so interesting, because I think that's one of the questions I wanted to talk about too. Now I'll show another picture, but this idea of who's in front of the camera, who's behind the camera, is interesting, and the fact that that we're photographing a natural landscape. So, like you pointed out, your purposes were very, very different in that decision than some of the early Bible land photography. But one of the things that I've been doing with Imagining the Holy is trying to use archival images as either ways of discussing how Palestine is represented and Palestinians are represented in the past and the present, but also as sites of remembering or kind of activating the archival photographs. And so it's interesting that even though your purposes are very different, the connection between them becomes a way to have the conversation. And so the other piece that I wanted to discuss with you is that these images, the ones that we're showing today from the archive, are also taken mostly by non-Palestinian photographers. So in this case, of the ones that we showed so far, it's mostly from the American colony photograph studio. So for those people who are not familiar with that, we have American and Swedish families moving to Jerusalem for religious purposes, setting up a sort of a compound where they lived and waited for certain religious signs to happen. But in the meantime, to make money, they had a photography department, one of the earliest photography. So we have this huge collection from Library of Congress that we're showing photos from today, taken mostly by Americans and Swedes, with some local Palestinian staff members who helped. And so one of the kind of critique maybe is I don't know if critique is the right word, but it's a question, because you're mentioning now the purpose of some of the decisions that you've that informed your project sound like they're related to the relationship to kind of like Western media or non-Palestinian media about Palestine, and representations for non-Palestinian audiences about Palestine. And so it raises the question to you as a non-Palestinian filmmaker, your relationship to the place and to the storytelling of that place. So it reminded me, even though it's different context, of Matson, who's one of the, Eric Matson is one of the American colony photographers. And I like this picture of him and Petra photographing, because it's one of the few where we see who's taking the image, and the context is very clear. So I wanted to hear, just to ask you about your relationship as a French filmmaker to Palestine, and telling the stories that you mentioned.
Yeah, I think this picture is very interesting as well. It's very rare to have this footage. It's quite amazing to have them, and also the two other people on the picture. Of course, my relation to Palestine is very different than someone who comes from there or who originates from there. And somehow I think that's also, it's always a very complicated questions when speaking about, in a large sense, documentary forms, and speaking of the other. And for me, there's a very subtle move or a shift to make in between speaking of the other and speaking for the other. Mm-hmm. And for me, that's where the limit is, in a way. And there's also something that this picture kind of brings in mind, is this choice, this artistic choice in the film to use very different kind of formats. So there's Super 8 analog film, mm-hmm. There is still photographs, there is digital video mixed together, and analog panoramic landscapes as well. And in some of the footage, the video ones, the ones where the writing appears, that's actually the only human presence, physical human presence of that appears in the film, is my hands manipulating the magnifying glass in order to make the text appearing. And all these kind of very obvious, very visible presence of the image making, for me was also very central regarding that question. And mainly I think the reason behind this was also a reflection upon the image making itself, and what does it mean to make an image. And very often we tend to forget. I mean, the film has this amazing ability of making the camera disappear, and we have the feeling, the illusion that we're facing reality, a bit like a photograph. Like, mm-hmm. Okay, that's a piece of reality, and that's actually not true. And all images are constructed, and something is in the frame and something is not in the frame, and something happened before I pressed the camera and something happened after. And all of these decisions, for me, it was very important to have them almost put in the foreground, and to be very honest in a way about all the manipulations and all the artifacts and the effects that were used. Mm-hmm. And also in a way to kind of include reflection on the medium itself, and on its relation to truth. And there was something very, very central, and also, I guess a very somehow very politically motivated position in this choice of, this is a construction, this is a story, and it's made of different fragments. The fact of having all these different formats, very visibly different, the stills, the Super 8s, the video, the text, was a way to make people remember that every image is a construction.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's why this picture of this man with the camera is very it's very, very beautiful in a way, because it kind of makes you take a step back and think of who took that image, for what purpose, and who was it made for, and what was the story that were intended to be told afterwards.
Yeah.
And all of this is,
No, go ahead.
No.
Yeah, but it's exactly the conversation we're having now. I think it's interesting that with archival images, because we encounter them in a different way than we do a film in a film festival, for example, where the film festival, it already has an author's name, we have a date, all of the biographical things you gave us at the beginning of our conversation, we know about the film. Archival images, sometimes they appear in different contexts, and that whole forensic thinking about who took it, how it was constructed, is so important to me in my work. When I look at archival images, that's kind of the point, to say, yes, this image captures Palestine in 1930 or 1920, but what we're seeing, how does it reflect reality, or whatever we can call reality, because it's really a document of an encounter between the filmmaker or the photographer and the subject, whether it's a natural landscape or whether it's a person. And it ties a little bit back to the question that I asked you about being non-Palestinian, telling a story about or in Palestine, because it's also saying who is the person, not just what are the mechanics of making it, which we talked about, but also who is the person and what subjectivity do they bring to the conversation or to the representation, I guess. But I also love the image. I'm going to put it one more time. I love the image for the same reason, because we forget that there's especially now with digital photography and digital filmmaking, we forget, I really love the choice of the other film formats that you use, because it reveals the constructed nature, which we forget because we can do it on our iPhone now. It's very easy to forget that there's actual mechanism to capture this stuff. And the decisions with other technology seem like they're more, you have to think about them more carefully, because it's not so easy to use other film. In this time, it took him so long to set up this camera setup. To make that image, he had to think very carefully about the framing of it, where maybe now it's a little bit easier. You just take your phone and you don't think about it as much.
Yeah. And also even the fact that the plate is broken.
Yeah,
it somehow also reveals the like what it's made of, and that's also something I like very much about the previous images. And when you see the little writings on the side of the picture.
Here, I'll go back. This is another picture where we saw the tape that's on top of the picture. We were talking about that a little bit. And then here in this first image, you have the label with the image number and the name from the catalog, exactly, and some scratches. I think these are even in pen. And it kind of reminds
all these scratches and all these writings, and the fact that somehow it's like the other one is broken on the side, or the emulsion that was put on the plate doesn't go until the top, for example, or you see these traces of the object being manipulated, and that's something I'm very interested in, and that's another kind of clue in this research around the materiality of the image, and the fact that it's also an artifact.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think that's a lovely way to end our conversation. It ties everything together really nicely. And that's the feeling really when I was watching the film. There's a lot of the presence of light kind of is the way the tree is the narrator, but the way that the words are revealed is through light, I think is interesting. The textures you mentioned about the tree bark and the landscape, and even the other fragments, the non-natural fragments, it's very textural. And so I think I like what we found with the archival images. We're speaking really closely about the materiality about those things, because that's what I felt like with watching your film. So is there anything else you wanted to add?
No, I think it's I think we're good.
Okay, thanks, Milena.
Thank you
Thank you.
very much, Yazan.
Take care. Bye.
Bye.